with Joel Nikoloff and not Darnell Samuels and nobody else actually at this moment. But if you listened to last week's episode, you know we're about to jump into part 2 of WTF is happening with FTX. That part we sort of already touched on the what is FTX and what happened as part 1 of the conversation. In part 2, we really jump into centralized versus decentralized finance and why IJ doesn't trust SBF. And we also touch on SBF's love affair with regulators and Democrats. On that note, Anthony, roll the clip.
If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense.
Obviously, what we're saying here has not been investment advice, and at some point, if we get
I don't
a little
think
bit
we
more,
said anything about buying, right? So
no, exactly. So, but even still, the asset as a whole, do your own due diligence. Obviously, FTX, FTT should be an example of how any of these coins could be a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
And be careful what you're investing in. So, coming back to that, I would say, what is it that made you not trust this guy? Is it the centralized versus decentralized part of it, or is it more to it?
I think it's how huge, one day FTX didn't exist, and then the next day it was all over. I couldn't, that 2021, anywhere I looked at, it was like FTX this, FTX this, FTX. I was like,
Where did it come from?
Where did it come from? And I mean, that is a totally different story to be had, but it was like, well, this is kind of weird. And then this guy's out here saying, I'm going to give all my money. Anytime somebody says that they're going to give all their money away and that, I want to make as much money as possible just to give it all away. It always makes me suspicious, right? Because if you grow up with no money, right, your goal is you make the money because you want to help your family, right? But then somebody who goes up and says, I want to make all the money in the world to then give it all away. It's like, well, obviously you weren't trying to make the money, in my opinion. There's another reason.
I would say the idea of not I want to give away. I want to have a lot to give away, right? That's not what he's saying, right? Yeah. I look at it like, okay, you care about people's perspective of you or the power such a thing will give you.
Yeah.
Right. There's an ulterior motive,
yeah.
Right? When especially the absolute nature of those statements, right? Mm-hmm. Again, I sort of intentionally used a different word of I want to have a lot of money so I can help a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. I'm first focusing on my own wealth, acknowledging that will allow me to do more.
Yes.
As opposed to I want to make money so I can give it all away.
100%. That's a great nuance you made there. That's a great nuance. If it said it the way you said it, right? I would be more trust because at this point there was a bunch of videos that came out of him, right? In his interviews, I had watched a bunch of interviews of his, little mini YouTube docu-series made by CNBC, and maybe it's not CNBC, I forget who it is. And I just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But on top of that, it's how much he started pushing. I mean, it was more so this year that he started pushing for regulation for the digital assets, right? That's when it was
you knew he wasn't trustworthy.
In a space that's decentralized, you're going around, in bed with all these regulators and essentially you're lobbying senators to sort of support regulating digital assets, trying to kill your competitors so that you can be the king of king. You can be the new king, right?
You'd be the kingmaker.
Yeah. So it was, and the connections. There's so many coincidental connections that. Yeah. There's a bunch of things. So yeah.
So for me, the centralized versus decentralized. I think another way of looking at it is I heard. It'll be I'll have a bunch of stuff in the show notes page, but one of the podcasts I was listening to, they use the terminology that the crypto industry looks at FTX like a historical financial institution. And the historical financial industry looks at FTX like a crypto business. Mm-hmm. And so that ties into the regulation piece, and I'll get there, and we'll get there.
Yeah.
But I think the nature of it's really that decentralized versus centralized, right? Centralized finance is historical legacy finance. That's what it is. That's what your bank is, right? You go to the bank, they're a centralized place where they hold your money for you. They control all the transactions you want to initiate and do it for you. You're not actually doing it, right? Like they have to send the money to your, Bell bill or your Bell account. Now you set it, you put all the programming in there, but they're the one actually, facilitating the transaction.
Yeah,
You're
on their
not.
own ledger, right? That's like,
Yeah. Well, this is why the legacy banking system has a 2-day clearinghouse, right? Like this 2-day clearinghouse is a centralized finance problem, or the symptom is maybe, or feature is probably a better term for it. Whereas the decentralized is getting to the idea that, like, I don't need them. Now, not to say you couldn't use an entity to work on your behalf, right? If you're in a business, or let's use a nonprofit world, I may want to use a custodian because that allows me to have double authentication. So in the nonprofit world, most checks have to have 2 signing officers. Well, I'm going to need some level of maybe let's say service provider if one of my signing officers is technologically incompetent. Right? And so it's not that I don't rely on people, but the idea is it's not like in Canada, we got 5 banks. In America, you've got the central banks that bail everybody out. And so you've essentially created this monolithic system. Back when we had a couple episodes, like 2 years ago, there's this one line that I love, and it was, and the name, what's his name? I'm gonna feel so bad that I can't remember. But the line was, "Centralization removes the means for error correction."
Centralization removes the means for error correction.
And in general, right? Like the more things are in one place, the inability for people who identify a problem to make a change.
Well, the more centralized something is, the more fragile it becomes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the idea is that when, remove the errors are there, the ability to correct it is small, and the ability for the error to cause it to break, what you're saying, fragile, right? So you're saying, I would say a similar thing to what I've said, right? Because it's more fragile because I can't correct for the error in a microcosm. And that's what, I would say the free market, or the market, is a number of decentralized actors all coming together, and they're aggregating information through prices. And so prices are communicating when, I got to make this change, I got to make that change. And that's where central planning or centralization, it's all top down pushed decision making, and the individual signals don't result in quick response. Whereas you're a small business, you're like, the cost of one of my supplies went way up. What do? I switch to the alternative. But if you're a huge business, the ability to do that, or, the bigger businesses have more difficulty to make such changes. And so that's where the more you continually to centralize, and like FTX, right? The issue is also that they were, and so let me read this little, it's called Sovereign Research and Advisory Group. It used to be called Sovereign Man. There's a podcast associated with this blog, but I'll put both in the show notes page. So this is the guy, his comment. He wrote this: "In my view, FTX isn't even a crypto business. It's a financial institution. Little different than the Bank of America. When you make a deposit in the Bank of America, that money becomes Bank of America's asset. In other words, legally, you no longer own your money. It's Bank of America's money. You become an unsecured creditor to the bank. And subject to certain regulatory limitations, Bank of America can go and gamble with your money on crazy loans and investment fads. We've seen plenty of examples of banks recklessly speculating with their depositors' funds in the past. The entire 2008 crisis, in fact, was because banks gambled with their customers' money, and it almost brought down the banking system. This is basically FTX's business model. They took in customers' deposits, including cash and crypto. Those deposits became FTX's assets, and customers became unsecured creditors of FTX. This is the way any financial institution works. And FTX was essentially a financial institution, highly centralized with a distinct lack of transparency and the added risk that the single moron had control over everything. Or a single moron, not the single moron. Frankly, this is the opposite of what crypto represents. Crypto is all about decentralization and transparency, and that no single person or group has control. So FTX in no way represents crypto. It's just another conventional financial institution that acted irresponsibly with other people's money.
And that's something that we didn't mention is the leaked
Balance sheet.
balance sheet, right? Well, through that we found out that SBF was my throat, one sec.
Yeah, I think where you're going, there's a whole bunch of loans to both SBF and other shareholders from these, like Alameda.
Yeah, they were
and so-
essentially going back and forth, and they were using users' funds to bail. Alameda needed money; they would take the users' fund.
Yeah, margin
which
call.
you're not supposed to do. Right? Which you're not supposed to do. And there's a funny video that's gone around of Caroline, the CEO of Alameda, where she said, I believe she has a BA in mathematics.
Oh, she's apparently like a math genius. Like
Okay,
her like she's apparently like really, really smart. I did a little bit of reading on her.
okay.
There's
I mean, but that's what everybody said about Sam Bankman-Fried as well, right? So
yes.
let's hold that.
I mean,
judgment
geniuses can still be idiots. Let's be serious.
But there was a video of her going on saying, "Oh, it's on a podcast where they asked her, how much math do you use?" And she said, "Oh, I don't really use complex math. I use like elementary math mainly. We also don't have margin calls." And
Until we had one.
And now retrospectively, I'm sure when people watching it, they're like, they must have thought, because I only saw this video post debacle. So I'm sure people who saw it then, if you're sort of caught up in the hype of FTX and Alameda, you're like, wow, this person's a genius. They don't even need to use complex math. That's how good they are. And now retrospectively, it's the opposite, right? But yes, they essentially just lent out. And that's what all your banks do, right? You don't own. I mean, the best example I know we talked about this in a previous episode is when the Freedom Convoy happened, people's banks were frozen, and they're frozen because they couldn't use their cards, they couldn't use anything because you're not the owner. You're essentially not the owner, and I think that's a difficult concept for maybe like older generations to grasp, if and where the freedom of Bitcoin specific. I feel like I've become more of a Bitcoin maximalist throughout this time,
dude. Okay, so I was gonna say this till the end, but I agree. I've been trending in that direction. I love Robert Breedlove's term. I'm a shitcoin minimalist.
Yeah, I like Robert Breedlove.
What that really is talking, and this is an oversimplification. So if you're big on proof of stake,
not financial advice.
Yes, not financial, but proof of work versus proof of stake. The shitcoin minimalist argument would be that proof of stake resembles fiat currency.
Oh, and it's more like it's a security, right? It's more of a security.
I would say to you, there's a greater opportunity for security because of the contractual part. But I think the way that I would look at it is I would say long term. This is somewhat of my hypothesis. Long term, proof of work it'll be a requirement for a base layer, sort of your true money. A lot of these proof of stakes will really be let's call them applications to a proof of work coin. Right. So something that's deemed money, these things will likely become layers on top of it that, and again, for the non-crypto person, really just think of it as like you're adding an application with a contract that uses money on top of the money system.
My future prediction with Bitcoin specifically, if it survives, which I think it'll survive, is that as humans become more and more advanced, and let's say we go interstellar, Bitcoin will become the payment. Because in space, gold is abundant, right? There's a freaking rock floating in space right now that's worth $1 trillion. Now, what are you going to do with that?
So this is the argument with gold. Historically, was an example of proof of work. And so that's where, the argument towards crypto is like, or Bitcoin, I should say, and Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's a better gold.
Yeah, but the idea is that I actually have to do work, which is sort of a hindrance to fraud, or a hindrance, right? Like the fact I can't just create the money, whereas proof of stake, I could just, in theory, create the money, and I don't have to do anything. Whereas proof of work, there's something that it's proven that somebody worked or executed energy in order to create this money. And so that I'm just trying to slight parallel. Again, there's lots of people who do a way better job of that than me. I think you've done a pretty good job on the decentralized finance. So let's touch on, SBF's love affair with regulators, as I refer to it, and then also, Democrats. You talked about him donating a bunch of money to the Bahamas government.
Yeah.
In 2020, he was the second biggest donor behind Bloomberg, and I think it was $20 million he had given to the Democrats. In the current election, he gave $40 million, and he was the second biggest donor behind George Soros.
Yeah, to the Democrat Party, to be
Democrats.
Clear.
Sorry.
Yes. To be
and
clear.
And he had planned. I think he said he
and
planned
this is
to give
days before, or even maybe a week or 2 weeks before the whole scandal erupted.
Yes.
40 million of users, most likely users' funds.
Yes.
Gone.
And he had said he was going to give $1 billion in the 2024 election, which would have blown every single, political donation money out of the water in terms of a historical precedent. So
there's so many strange things about FTX, right? Like, again, this is retrospectively, like there's some, like I mentioned, there's like coincidental timelines, right? Like in April, Biden announces his presidential election, and then SBF launches FTX, and then overnight it becomes like this huge success, right? It's like, what? It came out of nowhere. And then you had like, so this is where there's all these like very strange connections that are happening, right? So his,
I love this line. The problem with conspiracy theorists is they fill in the details. We're not filling in the details. We're just giving the details. We're not filling in the differences. We're just, here's the point. Here, this thing happened. This thing happened. What's the connection is, let's let the fraud investigators of FTX figure that out.
100%. That's the best way to put it. So there's some very interesting things. So both Sam Bankman-Fried parents and Caroline, his girlfriend, the CEO, both of their parents, or at least the father for her father, but both SBF's parents are profs, right? SBF's mom's Barbara Fried, because he took his parents' last name,
like the hyphenated
stuff, and she does like tax policy. She's like a professor that does expertise. She's an expert in tax policy and distributive justice. The father, Joseph, is helps Silicon Valley startups structure their money in such a way for taxes, and then both of them are huge Democrat supporters, and they both help. I forget what they call it. Like a term where you collect money in bundles, and then like bundle givers or something like that.
Oh, I think it's like the PACs or something like.
Yeah, they collect money and give it to the huge amounts, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. The other weird thing is Caroline, the CEO of Alameda, her father, right, Glenn, was an MIT prof, the chair, and you know who worked under him?
Who?
Gary Gensler.
And Gary Gensler is
the head of the SEC. And what was happening up until that point, and there's a senator in the U.S. That came out saying that we're going to investigate Gary Gensler because of his ties to Sam Bankman-Fried. Because Sam Bankman-Fried, I think there was some news that came out that Gary Gensler was helping SBF and FTX with regulatory advisory, like who was it helping advising, which is seems like a conflict of interest, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing with the whole regulation, right? Like the way regulation is happening in this industry is so problematic, period. Right? Like one, what you're talking about, FTX was like promoting regulation. And this is the thing, most people who maybe if you listen to the show, you listen to me rant and rave about regulation. I've always said free market is the greatest regulator, because as soon as you protect property rights, all other regulation is just in my opinion, just a byproduct of what a court system would rule anyways. You're just trying to prevent it. And the question of whether you actually prevent harm is where I think we never evaluate. My argument would be restitution is what matters. But anyways, the point is that in this industry, he's working with the regulators. And the argument would be the reason is to protect himself from competition. And the simple argument for that is this: the larger you are, the more you already have lawyers and people on payroll that will help you bear the burden of additional regulation, such that you're so big the regulation burden is relatively small. But if you're a small business, you basically have to do almost the same amount of work as a big business. So you end up bearing without the funds, right? So now you're bearing a higher burden, which essentially becomes a barrier to enter the market. So this is why you, as a big business, which FTX became, working with regulators becomes the ability to prevent decentralized exchanges, small exchanges, from exploiting, and exploiting is not the right word, but you're exploiting market opportunities that may be niche or small that FTX might have a handle on today because there's no competition. And so so that's one thing. He's working with regulators, trying to promote regulation in the industry. We sort of hinted at this already. The other problem with regulation here is that the SEC and others are trying to back their way into regulation. They're suing companies and forcing the court systems to say, yes, these regulations apply, rather than pass a regulation. And part of the reason they would do that is it makes it retroactive. Right? So the problem is that the regulators, in theory, sat on their hands for way too long. If they were going to regulate, they should have put something in place after the first ICO disaster. And in theory, that would have been the time to regulate, come up with guidance so that new companies know what the rules are. When you have no regulation, you leave it to companies to make judgment calls that you might turn around years later and say, no, that was the wrong call. Well, how was I supposed to know?
Right.
And so this is the problem that the SEC is doing, is they'll be like, I think Telegram's a good example. Telegram tried to create a coin. They were doing an initial offering on it. And then they had to crash it because the SEC is like, oh, no, this is security. We're going to sue you.
Oh, really? Interesting. I didn't know that.
I think this was like 2018. Like it was a long time ago, the Telegram one, if I'm not mistaken. But this is the thing. They're taking historically an abnormal approach to building regulation in the industry, which again, it just makes it such a much messier problem. And you end up potentially going you said it already. Arguably all the proof of stake stuff is a security. And if that's true, they dropped the ball. Right? Because in 2018, really when that ICO craze went crazy, you make that ruling then, changes the entire game for the next 5 years that we've all been living in.
But at the same time, would we see the amount of innovation that has happened since? Maybe not, right? So I mean, there's a lot that we'll find out what happens, right? Like because what SBF was doing, and if anybody in the crypto world knows BitBoy had this huge rant maybe like a week before this whole thing blew up, maybe 2 weeks before, about where he said SBF is I think he called SBF Satan or something. He's like he called him some sort of name about how he's been lobbying senators to essentially clamp down stronger on all these digital assets, and essentially and that's part of the reason why CZ, the founder, the CEO of Binance, they had some back and forth because he tweeted some cryptic tweet, right before all this happened, that there's some people going around Binance's back trying to get them out of the country, right? And retrospectively, that seems like it was FTX, right?
Yep.
And so it's and how did Sam have all this power? Well, one, we already mentioned he gave money to the government in the Bahamas. He was, he seems to be close to like Bill Clinton, because he was He had
on a
whole
panel, I think, with
on a
him.
panel. I think they had more than a panel. The panel
No,
was
but
like
I remember a clip.
Yeah,
Like,
that's right. And then FTX was even posted as a partner on the World Economic
WEF.
Forum,
Yep.
which,
Yep.
not surprising, they scrubbed it off their website. But if you go to the
Time
Wayback
Machine.
Machine,
Yeah, Wayback
you can
Machine.
find it. You can find it. It's there. And another WEF connection is SPF's aunt Linda Fried is a partner at the World Economic Forum, right? And so there are like all these
Peculiar
coincidental
connections.
connections, that are happening. So you wonder, because one thing that SPF never ever has revealed or has been quite wishy-washy about is where did he get the initial
Startup capital
to do
for
his,
Almeida,
yes,
right?
to do his arbitrage trading, which you need a ton of money to make a ton of money, right? But never once has, like, if you can find all these clips, I think now people are like clipping it together, of him, people asking, so where did you get initial capital? And then he'll like totally won't even answer that question. He'll answer some like random question, and people forget about
He'll
it.
ignore it. He'll just ignore
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Which, again, we're not filling in the details. We're not making any speculations. We're just pointing out all these obscure sort of random disconnections that go, dude, this, like, it's more and more like, if I want to be a little bit speculative, it's
Yeah.
almost like he was a plant,
That's what it seems like.
right? Like, even the failure is now like, we know that what's the political line, right? Never let a tragedy go to waste.
Yeah.
Like, the regulators are going to basically go, oh, this is the reason why,
You need to
crypto
regulate
needs
it.
to regulate. And
And all the work had been done prior to the collapse, right? All the lobbying, all the money had been done, and then the collapse happened. So now what?
well, and arguably, this is the one company who was closest to the regulators that
Yeah.
in theory should have been already the most protected because they were the ones knowing what the regulations were coming. I heard, and I can't remember where I heard this because I've been listening to a bunch of content. One of the things that happened was the regulators actually pushed all of the FTX US activity that
Yeah.
would have fallen outside of the regulation into the international entity, which means it's outside of the regulator's eyes anyways.
Huh.
Right. And so, think about it like all of the, I'm just oversimplifying, but let's say you have a super risky trading strategy that's not allowed in America. Well, what do? You do it in your partner entity that doesn't have that same restriction.
Right.
And so, because you can't regulate the entire world, what you're doing is you're pushing, certain rules that are arguably overly burdensome such that they go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's the same. Look at China, right? They tried to shut down Bitcoin mining
5 times.
right? Like people don't learn, like, regulation does not always, well, I should say the regulation never has perfectly intended consequences.
Yeah.
There's always unintended consequences because you're trying to manipulate people to do what you want. And from an economics perspective, the argument would be you need to change their incentives. The idea there is by adding a regulation, I'm removing the incentive. But that doesn't mean you didn't change the incentives. They still have incentives. You just ignored all the other potential ones that they had.
Mm-hmm.
And you went, well, because I took this away, they're now going to act this way.
And on the point about the regulation and pushing it off, one hypothesis that's sort of floating around as to why Binance didn't bite was that they realized if they bought FTX US and international, though technically FTX US was not part of it, and that's what they wanted, was that they would be able to be regulated by the US, by the feds. So
yeah, because they're not operating here.
No.
Right. Yeah.
So
which, like what you said about FTX, you can't come to Canada and or you can't use Binance in Ontario anymore.
That's right. You can. Yeah. I have to take my stuff off. I think like maybe in December or something, right? I think that's when they stop.
Yep. I mean, of course, if you're in Mexico, then you could use your Binance account because you're not in Ontario. But
okay.
But anyways, because I think it's more based on like IP address gets blocked, as opposed to. Okay. I mean, because they also have I think you can have a relatively low level of like proof of person. with all.
Yeah, I
With,
think there's like KYC1, KYC2, right? Something like
well,
that.
and I mean, but even like you could be a non KYC if you're not buying with fiat, right? Like most of these
Oh, okay.
exchanges,
I
right?
see. I
Like
see.
if
Like
you're
if you sent it
if I just
something
put
else.
crypto, like I can send cryptocurrency to an exchange. A lot
Mhm.
of exchanges, I could have a really low, like I literally have to give them an email address potentially. Now, these
Yeah.
might be more, less trustworthy than, like in Canada, your most trustworthy ones I would think would be ShakePay and Newton. At least they're the most
Shape
common.
Newton, CoinSquare. I think CoinSquare is actually the most trusted. It's
Oh,
like the
okay.
legacy one. It's a legacy one.
Right. But they're trusted here, but that's because they have a strong level of like prove who you are.
Yeah. You have
Now,
to, there's so many documentations.
right, you got to give them all this documentation. But you could then take that the crypto asset and send it to another exchange where all you had to give them was your email address,
Hmm.
and now potentially operate there. Now,
Yeah.
and maybe that's because I want some obscure coin like Bitcoin SV, and most exchanges don't have it.
Yeah.
So I go to the one that has it, and
Yeah.
if I'm in Ontario, I have to figure out a way to like do it while I'm in another country.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I mean, we've been. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's one last coincidental thing about this whole thing, about this whole FTX SPF. His brother, SPF, has a brother who has an organization called Influence Watch, where they openly state, like if you look up, I think it's like influencewatch.org or something, I forget what it is. If you look it up, it was created in 2020. It's just they openly state that they're left wing, and they support like a stronger regulation around pandemic stuff, pandemic prevention. I think that's the term. And on the about section, it says, and they're lobbying to get the lobbying is the term I'm using, but they're essentially lobbying to get $40 million. I think it's 40 million or 40 billion. It's one of them from the Biden administration to be put towards pandemic prevention. So, it's like his whole family is somehow tied up with politics, right? Both his parents are fun Democrat Party. His brother has this company, which is also openly left leaning, according to their site, and they have all these WTF ties. So, like you said, if anybody sort of looks at this just from an outside perspective without anything, just the info that's kind of
Yeah,
dropped,
the
you
data
think
points.
there's like this is way there are too many coincidental things for it just to be coincidence. Now it could obviously at the end of the day it could still be coincidence.
Well, and I mean, what's crazy? Like again, I made reference to Bernie Madoff already, but like
He
contrast
was
is
the head of the SEC, wasn't he?
no, Bernie Madoff, he was
What
the
was it?
greatest Ponzi scheme
No,
of
no.
known to mankind.
Yes, but
Okay.
but while he was
Oh,
doing that, I think he was like the chief something for I forget what it was, because what ended up happening was there was a 15-page document leaked to the SEC about the Ponzi scheme, and the SEC ignored it. I forget what it was.
well, and I mean, when the reason I brought him up though was like, think about how long that scheme went on, right? Like this is like, no, I'm sure the Bernie Madoff scheme partly was an aspect of I stopped getting as good of results as I was early on, and I wanted to keep up my reputation, and then it got out of control.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming you probably have a similar scenario here, but it took, something like Luna being the catalyst, right? So had Luna not happened earlier in this year, and my guess is they didn't really have a good standard of, hey, let's not invest in this or invest in that, right?
Yeah, but they also think that there's also the running around the hypothesis running out that SPF is the one that took down Luna. Right.
Fair.
That he was who had all the bets against it. So
true. I mean, we'll find out, I'm sure, as this company's probably going to become a very transparent through all of the investigation and whatnot. So, to wrap up as we do, what's your 2 cents, and for the audience?
What's my 2 cents? Do you remember the CEO of Theranos? Do you remember what her name is?
No.
Theranos was this big biotech company that.
Oh, I do know what you're talking about.
What her name is, though. How can I forget her name? The only reason I'm bringing her up because there's some sort of there's like a small connection. So she Theranos was a company, a startup, huge startup,
Elizabeth Holmes.
Elizabeth Holmes. And there's this company had such huge valuation. They said they could, they could detect cancer through they said a bunch of them with like one drop of the blood. And she was also, unsurprisingly, on Fortune 500, and then turns out the whole thing was a scam. Like the technology never worked. She had relations with her CTO, just like Sam Bagman had relations with the Almeida CEO, and she just got her sentence for 11 years. Unfortunately, and I would say she did quite a lot of damage to people, because there were people who took the testing, because I think it was in Walgreens, their little
Kit.
their kit, and there were people who were misdiagnosed, like because of this. But then she only got 11 years, which, I don't know if that's, obviously I'm not a law expert here, but 11 years doesn't. Maybe that seems like a lot. To me, it doesn't seem like a lot for the massive screw up that Jesus. So with SPF, maybe you'll get like 125 years, because there's so much involved. But who knows?
Dude,
Maybe
honestly,
10
though,
years.
I wouldn't be surprised if Ross Ulbricht still has a way bigger charge than he does.
Yeah.
Right? Do you know Ross Ulbricht?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Of course, I'm assuming you do. For the listener, basically Silk Road, he created this crypto. He created basically like a market for people to buy and sell.
It's a marketplace.
It was a marketplace.
That's it.
It just used crypto, so it resulted in a lot of people doing business in things that the government didn't want them to be doing business in. But because he created this marketplace, the guy's got like 120 years or something ridiculous.
Yeah, something ridiculous.
But he never did a single thing violent. He's purely like, a young kid who arguably made a mistake, and, they threw the book at him. And I would say, to me, it's simple.
It should be the reverse at this point, right?
You challenge the state is much more of an offense than defrauding somebody.
Defrauding millions of people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You challenge the state, they'll put you through hell. You destroy a bunch of people's lives, which, a bunch of people's life savings were on FTX. So, but the state doesn't really care too much about it. I mean, they do care, but not at this level with Silk Road, which to me still blows my mind. People use money to do all sorts of illegal things, but none of the ATMs are in are destroyed. Yeah. Anyways, that's my 2 cents, Joel.
Yeah. No. And for me, the issue that I see is around sort of the regulation side of it, right? That like, there is nothing regulation could have done to prevent this. Right. And this is the problem, right? Like, the Bernie Madoff was under all of the regulations you could have been under. When someone's committing fraud and they're deceiving people, regulations don't make a difference. Right. And I love, there was the one line in the piece that I read that he said, and FTX was essentially a financial institution, highly centralized and a distinct lack of transparency, with the added risk that a single moron had control over everything. So highly centralized and a distinct lack of transparency. What's crazy is what happened in response to this. I don't know if all the exchanges that I'm on, I got an email telling me about, here is the method that we operate.
Yes.
Essentially demonstrating we're not like FTX.
Yeah.
And one of the best ones I heard of people refer to is Kraken, as an exchange where we don't touch the customer's assets. We don't touch the customer's funds. Right. So this is what I saw from ShakePay and Newton. Basically,
ShakePay,
statement
Newton, CoinSquare, they all did it.
Right. Sending an email just confirming we did, like, here's how we operate. And so, and I've heard someone else say the solution to stuff like this is for businesses in this industry, in crypto, to be exceptionally transparent on here's how we operate. Here's how we make money. Here's what we do. Right. And I think a similar total random that someone was talking about it to me at work today. What's happening with the credit card companies, right? They got sued. And now they're they basically had a stipulation. They weren't allowing their customers to charge the up fee for the expense that MasterCard and Visa would charge them for
That's
processing transactions.
Yeah.
Well, now businesses are going to be allowed to charge that. And
Yeah.
the reason I bring that up is like us as customers were lacking transparency because we didn't understand. Hey, if I paid by debit, I only charge the company 10 cents as a fee versus 4.5% or whatever my credit card was going to charge. And so that me in the industry, like in finance, I get it. I knew it. If I went to a small business, I would use my debit card on purpose. If I went to like shop, big business, big corp, I don't care. Like I'm not trying to help you out, right? But my point is like transparency influences my behavior, and so I think that really is, when you start to go, and again, go back to what I say about regulation. Why is the free market the best regulator? Because reputation becomes the primary decision maker. What I would argue happens through regulation and through things like FTX, people gain a false sense of trust because, someone else is going to make sure they're not screwing me.
And that they have what's coming out as a proof of reserve, right? To show what you actually have. Now, again, that's I think that's much better. That's probably like the best thing to do right now, but it's still, you can still be manipulated. But there's I think the next, I wonder if crypto.com, which is one of the other large exchange, sponsor of the UFC, sponsors a bunch of other stuff, if that's going to fall, because they also have their own they created their own token called CRO or Crow, and I forget what the valuation is at right now, but if that falls, it's like two of America's, I wouldn't say America's there, and Coinbase is still there, but it's so we'll see what happens in the next few.
And I think, again, go back to like what this article said, that reckless speculating with depositors' funds. The reason why FTX failed is because they don't have a central bank to bail them out, right? And so this is the point where, again, I would argue this is demonstrating the business case for crypto, because the companies that take my assets and play with them in order to get return are also the ones who are going to be saying, we'll pay you 8% to hold your coins here.
Yeah, or 20%. Like, there's one crazy one that was like 30%.
Well, this is not investment advice. The sniff test that I've heard was basically along those lines. If somebody is offering you high returns, how are they getting it? How are they able to pay you?
This is why I never trusted Celsius. That was the other company. I know it was big. A lot of people loved it because I forget what his name is. Alex was like all over a bunch of darling crypto podcasts. He was like, it's, but anytime, because Celsius was providing, I think, like 6 or 8% returns if you deposited your Bitcoin. And I had a friend that was thinking about Celsius. I was like, man, I would never put it in. Don't put it in.
Don't touch it.
I don't think he ended up doing it. And then, lo and behold, Celsius went, boom, collapsed. So Joel's giving great advice. If it was an advice, I'm not saying it's advice, but
Joel, I said sniff test for avoiding.
It's a sniff test for avoiding.
I mean, I'm not telling you where to put your money. I'm telling you not to where it's maybe not a good call.
Yeah, via negativa. That's what.
But that's where the question is: where are they getting the return? Are they getting the return because they actually have an exceptionally strong business model, and they're demonstrating here's why we make so much money, right? Like use Coinbase as a good example. Is it because you're adding liquidity and they're making higher returns because they're offering a Coinbase Pro trading platform that gives you more info? And so, they need liquidity and that's why, right? And again, I'm just sort of making up a scenario where like the rationale behind why can they pay the returns is what's more important than just going after the return. So IJ, thank you. We appreciate your time. For the audience, how can they reach out to you? How can they get in contact with you or follow you? What's up with you?
Twitter, IJ McCann, McCann. I forgot I didn't put my last name on this thing. That's where I'm at usually. And then on it you can find a Substack that I write, which is like IJMcCann.substack, and then aiming for the return of Casino Dialogue, and then we'll have Joel back as a guest. So that will probably happen like next year. So it's like we took a break for a bit, but yeah, thanks Joel for having me on. Thanks Darnell for not being present, so I could be here.
That's good. But, well, and I mean, this is for the audience. I'm assuming I'll probably figure out a way to split this into 2 episodes because we're an hour and 20 in. So if you've made it through the second episode, likely, thank you, and we appreciate you. 6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.